On a cold February morning in 2001, in the quiet mountain town of Colorado Springs, Colorado, a young woman named Jennifer Harris walked out of her apartment to start her car and never came back. Her roommate found the door ajar, keys still hanging in the lock, her coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter with steam still rising from the surface. The engine of her Honda Accord hummed in the parking lot below, exhaust clouding in the freezing air. Jennifer was 23 years old, a graduate student at the University of Colorado, studying environmental science. She had plans that afternoon to meet her sister for lunch. She never made it. For 24 years, her family waited for answers. For 24 years, investigators chased shadows and dead ends. And for 24 years, someone who knew exactly what happened walked free among them. The question that haunted Colorado Springs was simple, yet impossibly complex. Where was Jennifer Harris? Colorado Springs sits at the base of Pikes Peak, elevation 6,000 feet, where the Great Plains meet the Rocky Mountains in a collision of geography that creates weather as unpredictable as it is dramatic. In February, the city experiences what locals call the shoulder season, those weeks between the deep freeze of January and the fall spring of March, when temperatures can swing 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The town in 2001 was a place caught between identities. Military families from nearby Fort Carson mixed with college students, retirees drawn by the mountain views, and outdoor enthusiasts who came for the hiking and stayed for the lifestyle. It was the kind of place where people recognized faces at the grocery store, but didn't necessarily know names. A place where community existed in theory more than practice. Jennifer Harris had moved to Colorado Springs 18 months earlier, transferring from a smaller university in Nebraska to pursue her master's degree. She lived in the Parkview Apartments, a 3-story complex built in the 1970s, its brown siding faded to the color of old cardboard. The apartment sat on the north side of town, near a commercial strip of chain restaurants and big box stores. Her unit, number 214, faced the parking lot. She shared it with Melissa Torres, another graduate student she'd met through a housing board at the university. Those who knew Jennifer described her as methodical, organized, someone who kept a detailed planner and rarely deviated from her routines. She ran 4 mornings a week, always the same 5-mile loop through Monument Valley Park. She studied at the same corner table in the university library every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. She called her mother every Sunday at exactly 7 in the evening. The morning of February 7th began unremarkably. Melissa woke first, around 6:30, to the sound of the shower running. She heard Jennifer moving around in her room, the familiar sounds of drawers opening and closing, hangers sliding on a rod. By 7:15, Jennifer emerged from her bedroom dressed in jeans and a gray fleece pullover, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She poured coffee from the pot Melissa had started, added cream and sugar, stirred it exactly 12 times. Melissa remembered this detail later because she'd counted once, amused by Jennifer's precision. They talked briefly about nothing important, the weather, an exam Melissa had the following week, a documentary they'd both watched the night before. At 7:42, Jennifer said she was going to warm up the car. The temperature outside hovered around 14 degrees, and her Honda took several minutes to defrost. She grabbed her keys from the hook by the door, slipped on her winter coat, a navy blue Columbia jacket with a torn pocket she'd been meaning to repair. Melissa heard the apartment door close, heard Jennifer's footsteps on the exterior stairwell, heard them fade as she descended to the parking lot below. What Melissa didn't hear, in the minutes that followed, was Jennifer coming back up those stairs. At first, the absence didn't register. Melissa finished her own coffee, gathered her backpack, checked her phone. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The apartment felt too quiet in that particular way silence has of drawing attention to itself. Melissa walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot. Jennifer's Honda sat there, exhaust still visible in the cold air, driver's door closed, windshield cleared of frost. But Jennifer was nowhere in sight. Melissa pulled on her coat and went downstairs. She approached the Honda cautiously, uncertain why she felt the need for caution. The car was locked. She peered through the windows. Jennifer's backpack sat on the passenger seat. Her water bottle was in the cup holder. Everything looked normal, untouched, except for the fact that Jennifer herself was missing. Melissa called her cell phone. She heard it ringing somewhere, muffled, and traced the sound to Jennifer's backpack inside the car. The phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. That's when Melissa went back upstairs and found the apartment door slightly ajar. Jennifer's keys still dangling from the exterior lock where she'd left them when she went down to start the car. The coffee mug still sat on the counter, a skin forming on the surface of the liquid inside. Melissa stood in the doorway for a moment, her breath visible in the cold air, trying to construct a reasonable explanation. Maybe Jennifer had run to a neighbor's apartment. Maybe she'd forgotten something in her car and was searching for it. Maybe there was a simple answer that would reveal itself in seconds. But seconds became minutes, and minutes became an hour. And by 9 o'clock that morning, Melissa Torres was on the phone with the Colorado Springs Police Department, her voice shaking as she tried to explain that her roommate had vanished somewhere between their apartment and the parking lot 30 feet below. The first officers arrived at 9:27. They took Melissa's statement, checked the apartment, examined the car. They asked the standard questions. Had Jennifer been depressed? Were there any relationship problems, any financial troubles, any indication she might have wanted to disappear? Melissa answered no to everything. Jennifer had been fine, normal, happy even. She'd been excited about her research project, looking forward to spring break when she planned to visit her parents in Nebraska. There were no signs, no warnings, nothing that suggested she would simply walk away from her life. The officers took notes. They said someone would follow up. They said not to worry yet, that most missing persons cases involving adults resolved within 24 hours. People got into arguments, went to cool off, came back. People had momentary crises, made impulsive decisions, then thought better of it. The officers were professional but not particularly concerned. Not yet. By noon, Jennifer's sister Rachel had driven up from Denver, her face pale and pinched with worry. By 2 in the afternoon, their parents were on the highway driving the 7 hours from Lincoln, Nebraska, their minds churning through every possibility except the one they couldn't bear to consider. By evening, as the sun set behind Pikes Peak and the temperature dropped toward zero, a small group had gathered in the apartment. Family members, a few of Jennifer's classmates, Melissa. Everyone sat in stunned silence, phones in hand, waiting for a call that didn't come. The swing hung still in the children's playground visible from Jennifer's window. The toy truck lay on its side in the sandpit, abandoned. The parking lot lights flickered on automatically as darkness fell, casting long shadows across the pavement where Jennifer's Honda still sat, engine long since cooled, frost reforming on the windshield. Somewhere between 7:42 and 8 o'clock that morning, in broad daylight, in a complex with dozens of residents, Jennifer Harris had simply ceased to exist. Part 2, the investigation. The search began in earnest on February 8th, less than 24 hours after Jennifer's disappearance. Colorado Springs police organized teams to canvass the neighborhood, knocking on every door in the apartment complex and the surrounding blocks. Detectives interviewed residents, asking the same questions over and over. Did you see anything unusual yesterday morning? Did you hear any sounds? Any arguments? Any vehicles that didn't belong? Any strangers in the area? Most people had seen nothing. A few remembered hearing a car engine running early in the morning, but that was hardly unusual. One resident, An elderly man who lived on the ground floor mentioned seeing a dark-colored truck parked near the dumpsters around 7:30, but he couldn't describe it in detail and wasn't certain about the time. Another witness, a woman who'd been leaving for work, thought she might have seen someone walking quickly across the parking lot, but she'd been fumbling with her own keys and hadn't paid attention. The details were vague, contradictory, unhelpful. The apartment complex had no security cameras. The nearest traffic cameras were half a mile away on Academy Boulevard. Detectives pulled footage from every business within walking distance, gas stations and convenience stores and fast food restaurants, looking for any sign of Jennifer. They found nothing. It was as if she'd evaporated. Search and rescue teams arrived on the third day. Volunteers from El Paso County Search and Rescue spread out across Monument Valley Park, the open space areas north of the city, the trails Jennifer used for her morning runs. They walked in careful lines, eyes on the ground, searching for anything. A piece of clothing, a footprint, a disturbed area of earth. The weather complicated everything. Snow had fallen overnight on February 8th, not heavily, but enough to cover any tracks that might have been left. The searchers worked methodically through slush and mud, their breath clouding in the cold air, their faces grim with the understanding that each passing hour reduced the likelihood of finding Jennifer alive. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Flyers went up across the city, Jennifer's face starring out from telephone poles and bulletin boards and storefront windows. Her photograph showed a young woman with an easy smile, dark eyes that seemed to hold a question. The caption read, "Missing, Jennifer Harris. Last seen February 7, 2001. The local television stations ran stories. The newspaper published updates. A tip line was established and calls poured in. Most led nowhere. Someone thought they'd seen Jennifer at a gas station in Pueblo. Someone else was certain she was the woman they'd spotted at Denver International Airport. Every lead was investigated, every sighting checked. All of them proved false. Detectives turned their attention to Jennifer's personal life. They examined her phone records, her bank statements, her email account. They interviewed her professors, her classmates, her friends. They spoke with her ex-boyfriend from Nebraska, who dated her briefly 2 years earlier. They looked for any indication of trouble, any secret that might explain her disappearance. They found nothing suspicious. Jennifer's life appeared exactly as it seemed. Ordinary, stable, unremarkable in all the ways that make someone's sudden vanishing all the more disturbing. Clear's throat. But there was someone the detectives kept coming back to. Someone whose name appeared repeatedly in their notes. Someone who'd been among the first to arrive at the apartment complex that morning. Tyler Morrison was 26 years old, a maintenance worker at Parkview Apartments. He lived in Unit 108, ground floor, directly below Jennifer's apartment. He'd worked at the complex for 3 years, handling repairs and general upkeep. Those who knew him said he was quiet, reliable, kept mostly to himself. He drove a dark blue Ford F-150, older model, with a dented rear bumper and a toolbox in the bed. He'd been the one who'd helped Jennifer move her furniture when she first arrived at Parkview. He'd fixed her bathroom sink the previous November when it started leaking. Melissa remembered him as polite but awkward, the kind of person who had difficulty maintaining eye contact during conversations. On the morning of February 7th, Tyler Morrison had been at work. He'd clocked in at 7 o'clock, according to the maintenance log. He told detectives he'd spent the morning in the basement storage area organizing supplies. No one could verify this. The basement had no windows, no cameras, no other workers present. When asked if he'd seen or heard anything unusual, Tyler said no. He'd been in the basement. He hadn't heard about Jennifer's disappearance until Melissa came down to the maintenance office around 9:30, asking if anyone had seen her roommate. Detectives noticed something in Tyler's demeanor during the interview. He was calm, almost unnaturally so. His hands didn't shake. His voice didn't waver. When they asked him about his relationship with Jennifer, he said they were friendly but not friends. When they asked if he could account for his movements that morning, he repeated the same story. Basement, organizing supplies, alone. When they asked if they could search his apartment and his truck, he said yes without hesitation. The search of Tyler Morrison's apartment revealed a space that was exceptionally clean, almost sterile. Detectives photographed everything. The furniture was minimal. The kitchen was spotless. The bedroom contained a made bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a single lamp. There were no computers, no visible electronics beyond a television and a radio. In the closet, they found work clothes, all neatly hung. In the bathroom, basic toiletries arranged in precise rows. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed suspicious. The truck was equally unremarkable. Tools in the bed. An odometer reading that showed 73,000 miles. The interior was clean but not excessively so. Fast food wrappers in the door pocket. A maintenance manual in the glove compartment. Detectives noted everything, photographed everything, but found nothing that connected Tyler Morrison to Jennifer's disappearance. Still, something bothered them. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Tyler's composure, about the way his answers came too quickly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed, about the fact that his apartment felt unlived in, staged, like a display rather than a home, about the way he'd volunteered his truck and apartment for search without a moment's hesitation, which could indicate either innocence or confidence that nothing incriminating would be found. They looked deeper. Tyler Morrison had no criminal record. He'd grown up in Colorado Springs, attended Palmer High School, graduated without distinction. He'd worked a series of jobs after graduation, mostly manual labor, mostly positions that required minimal interaction with others. He had no close friends that investigators could identify, no girlfriend, no social life that anyone could describe. His parents had divorced when he was young. His mother had moved to Arizona years ago. His father had passed away from a heart attack in 1997. Tyler seemed to exist in a kind of isolation that was voluntary yet complete. Detectives brought him in for a second interview on February 14th, exactly 1 week after Jennifer's disappearance. They asked if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test. Tyler agreed. The test was administered by a certified examiner, questions carefully calibrated to establish baseline responses before moving to relevant inquiries. Did you see Jennifer Harris on the morning of February 7th? Did you have any contact with Jennifer Harris that morning? Do you know what happened to Jennifer Harris? Tyler's responses were consistent. No, no, no. The polygraph results came back inconclusive, which meant nothing definitive but also did nothing to eliminate him as a person of interest. The investigation continued through February and into March. Teams searched the area surrounding the apartment complex again and again. They dragged nearby retention ponds. They brought in cadaver dogs that alerted in several locations, but found nothing when those sites were excavated. They interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses, hoping someone would remember a crucial detail they'd initially overlooked. The media coverage intensified, then gradually faded as newer stories competed for attention. Jennifer's parents stayed in Colorado Springs for 3 weeks before returning to Nebraska, their faces aged by grief and uncertainty. Her sister Rachel visited every weekend, keeping the search alive through sheer force of will. Melissa moved out of the apartment in March, unable to bear the sight of Jennifer's empty room, the coffee mug still sitting on the counter where she'd left it that morning. By summer, the case had gone cold. Detectives still worked it, but fewer hours, fewer resources. The tip line still existed, but calls had slowed to a trickle. Jennifer Harris had become another name in a file, another photograph in a database, another family waiting for closure that might never come. Tyler Morrison continued living at Parkview Apartments. He continued working maintenance. He went about his days as if nothing had happened, as if a young woman hadn't vanished from the building where he lived and worked. Some residents avoided him, crossing to the other side of the parking lot when they saw him approaching. Others treated him normally, unwilling to condemn someone based on suspicion alone. He seemed not to notice either reaction. The swing hung still in the playground. The parking space where Jennifer's Honda had been towed sat empty. The apartment building settled into a new normal, one in which Jennifer Harris had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. Part 3, The Silence. 3 years passed, then 5, then 10. The calendar pages turned with that relentless momentum that doesn't pause for grief or uncertainty. Jennifer's parents, Robert and Susan Harris, tried to rebuild their lives in Lincoln, but the absence of their daughter created a wound that wouldn't heal. They kept her bedroom exactly as it had been, her books still on the shelves, her high school track trophies still gathering dust on the dresser. Susan Harris couldn't bring herself to change anything, as if Jennifer might walk through the door at any moment and need to find everything in its place. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have ever felt suspicion creep into your thoughts despite your best efforts to ignore it, you understand the particular torture of uncertainty. It's not the same as grief. Grief has shape and stages, a process that moves toward acceptance, however slowly. Uncertainty is shapeless. It shifts and changes. It allows hope and despair to coexist in the same breath. Rachel Harris, Jennifer's younger sister, became an advocate for missing persons. She volunteered with organizations that helped families navigate the impossible limbo of having a loved one vanish. She spoke at events, her voice steady even as her hands trembled, about the need for better resources, better databases, better coordination between agencies. She never mentioned her sister by name during these speeches, but everyone who knew her understood that Jennifer was present in every word. In Colorado Springs, life moved on as life does. The Parkview Apartments changed ownership in 2004. The new management company renovated several units, updated the landscaping, installed security cameras throughout the property. Too late for Jennifer, but perhaps in time to prevent another tragedy. Tyler Morrison continued working there under the new ownership. He'd become senior maintenance supervisor by 2008, a promotion that came with a modest raise and additional responsibilities. He kept the same apartment, drove the same truck, maintained the same sparse existence. But there were moments, small revealing moments that suggested something beneath the surface wasn't quite right. A resident named Patricia Valdez, who'd moved into the complex in 2006, later told investigators that Tyler had made her uncomfortable on several occasions. He would show up to fix things she hadn't reported as broken. He would linger after completing repairs, making conversation that felt forced and strange. Once, she'd come home to find him in her apartment, ostensibly checking the furnace, but when she asked how he'd gotten in, he simply said he had a master key. She'd reported the incident to management, but nothing came of it. Tyler explained that he'd received a work order, which the office had no record of, but these things sometimes got lost in the system. Another resident, a young woman named Kimberly Chen who lived alone in a ground floor unit, mentioned to a friend that Tyler had asked her out for coffee 3 times over the course of a month. Each time she'd politely declined. After the 3rd rejection, she'd started noticing him in the parking lot more frequently, always seeming to be working on something near her apartment, always watching without appearing to watch. She'd considered moving but decided she was being paranoid. People lived in the same complex. Seeing each other was inevitable. In 2012, 11 years after Jennifer's disappearance, a different investigation brought Tyler Morrison to the attention of law enforcement again. A woman named Amanda Garrett filed a restraining order against him, claiming he'd been following her. Amanda worked at a coffee shop Tyler frequented. She said he'd started coming in daily, always sitting at the same table, always watching her. He'd asked for her number. She'd said no. He'd asked again the next day, and the next. When she continued refusing, he'd started appearing in places he shouldn't have been. Outside her apartment building, at the grocery store she used, in the parking lot of her gym. The restraining order was granted. Tyler Morrison violated it twice, driving past Amanda's apartment slowly enough that she noticed and called police. He was arrested, charged with violating the protective order, spent a weekend in jail before posting bail. His attorney negotiated a plea deal, probation, mandatory counseling, a criminal record that would have meant very little to anyone not specifically looking for it. But Detective Sarah Chen was looking. She joined the Colorado Springs Police Department in 2005, 4 years after Jennifer's disappearance. As part of her training, she'd reviewed cold cases, and Jennifer's file had stayed with her. Something about the circumstances, about the proximity of Tyler Morrison, about the complete absence of evidence despite a thorough investigation, bothered her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. When Tyler's name appeared in the system in connection with the restraining order violation, Detective Chen pulled Jennifer's file again. She read through every interview, every report, every note the original investigators had made. She saw their suspicions, saw how they'd investigated Tyler thoroughly and found nothing. But she also saw patterns, the isolated lifestyle, the fixation on women, the ability to seem completely normal while doing things that, examined individually, seemed innocent but collectively painted a disturbing picture. Detective Chen began her own quiet investigation. She re-interviewed Melissa Torres, who was living in California now, married with 2 children, but who still thought about Jennifer every day. Melissa described Tyler's awkwardness, his too frequent appearances at their apartment to fix things, the way he'd sometimes just stand in their doorway making conversation long after the repair work was done. She mentioned something she hadn't thought important at the time. About a week before Jennifer disappeared, Tyler had asked her if Jennifer was seeing anyone. Melissa had said no. Jennifer was focused on school. Tyler had nodded and said that was good, that Jennifer seemed like the kind of person who should be careful about who she trusted. The comment had struck Melissa as odd, but she'd forgotten about it in the chaos following Jennifer's disappearance. Now, more than a decade later, it felt significant. Detective Chen drove out to Parkview Apartments, which was now called Mountain View Terrace after another ownership change and another renovation. She walked through the complex, measuring distances with her eyes. From Tyler's apartment to the stairwell Jennifer would have used. From the stairwell to the parking lot. From the parking lot to the basement entrance. Everything was close, convenient, interconnected. She requested records from the maintenance office, going back to 2001. Most had been destroyed or lost during the ownership changes, but she found a few documents that survived. Work orders, time sheets. On February 7, 2001, Tyler Morrison had clocked in at 7. There were no work orders assigned to him that day. His time sheet showed 8 hours worked, clocking out at 3:30 in the afternoon. Detective Chen pulled Tyler's current vehicle registration. The Ford F-150 from 2001 was long gone, sold in 2003 to a dealer in Pueblo who'd since gone out of business. The truck's current whereabouts were unknown. That vehicle, which had been searched but never forensically examined in detail, was lost to time. She knew she didn't have enough for an arrest warrant. She didn't have enough for a search warrant. She had suspicions, patterns, a growing certainty that Tyler Morrison knew exactly what had happened to Jennifer Harris. But certainty wasn't evidence. Patterns weren't proof. So she waited. She watched. She kept Jennifer's case file on her desk, reviewing it regularly, looking for anything the original investigators might have missed. For those who have ever pursued something impossible, who have ever refused to let go despite every reasonable voice telling you to move on, you understand what drives that kind of dedication. It wasn't just about justice. It was about the fundamental wrongness of someone vanishing without a trace, without answers, without anyone being held accountable. The years continued to pass. 2015, 2018, 2020. Tyler Morrison turned 45, still working maintenance at the apartment complex, still living alone, still existing in that strange isolation that was both voluntary and somehow enforced by who he was. Detective Chen retired in 2023, passing Jennifer's file to younger investigators who promised to keep it active, though everyone understood what active meant for a case more than 2 decades old. And then, in the early summer of 2024, something broke. Part 4, The Revelation. The trigger was almost absurdly mundane. A water heater failure in Unit 316 at Mountain View Terrace. Tyler Morrison went to assess the damage on June 12, 2024, entering the apartment with his master key as he'd done thousands of times over 23 years. The resident, a graduate student named David Park, was home. He'd called in the maintenance request that morning after discovering his shower had no hot water. Tyler examined the water heater, determined it needed replacement, and began gathering his tools. As he worked, he made conversation with David, the kind of idle talk maintenance workers and residents exchange. Weather, traffic, the inconvenience of broken appliances. Then Tyler mentioned he'd worked at the complex for over 20 years. David, being polite, asked if he'd seen many changes. Tyler's response was casual, almost offhand. He said the biggest change was all the security cameras. He said they made his job harder because he couldn't move around without being recorded. He said it was different in the old days, when you could go anywhere in the building and nobody would know. He said the basement used to be a good place to store things because nobody ever went down there. David thought nothing of the comment at the time, but later that evening, scrolling through local news on his phone, he saw an article about Jennifer Harris. It was a remembrance piece, published every year on the anniversary of her disappearance in February, but the algorithm had served it to David in June for reasons only the internet understands. The article mentioned that Jennifer had lived at Parkview Apartments, now called Mountain View Terrace. It mentioned that she'd vanished without a trace. It included a photograph of the complex from 2001. David stared at the photograph, then at the date, then thought about Tyler's comment about the basement being a good place to store things. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Tyler was just making conversation. But the comment nagged at him, that specific phrase. A good place to store things because nobody ever went down there. He called the tip line listed in the article. He explained what Tyler had said, emphasizing that it might mean nothing, that he could be completely wrong. The operator took down the information and forwarded it to the detective currently assigned to Jennifer's case, a young investigator named Marcus Rodriguez, who'd inherited the file only 6 months earlier. Detective Rodriguez read David Park's tip with interest. He pulled the file, reviewed the history of Tyler Morrison's involvement. He saw the original investigator's suspicions. He saw Detective Chen's notes from her years of monitoring Tyler. He saw the pattern of behavior that suggested someone capable of deception and violence hidden beneath a facade of normalcy. He made a decision. He would interview Tyler Morrison again, 23 years after the last formal interview. The interview took place on June 19, 2024, at the Colorado Springs Police Department. Tyler arrived voluntarily, driving himself in his current vehicle, a newer Toyota Tacoma. He wore work clothes, jeans, and a maintenance uniform shirt with his name embroidered on the chest. He seemed neither nervous nor particularly concerned. Detective Rodriguez started with simple questions, background information, how long Tyler had worked at Mountain View Terrace, whether he remembered Jennifer Harris. Tyler answered everything calmly. Yes, he remembered. It was terrible what happened. He'd helped with the search efforts back then. Then Rodriguez mentioned David Park's tip. He said, "I understand you made a comment about the basement being a good place to store things." Tyler's expression didn't change. He said, "I might have said something like that. We were talking about the building. The basement is storage." Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. He said, "You specifically mentioned that in the old days, nobody ever went down there." Tyler shrugged. He said, "That's true. Before the renovations, the basement was just my workspace. Nobody else had reason to go down." Rodriguez let the silence stretch. Then he said, "Did you store anything down there in February 2001? The question hung in the air. For the first time, Tyler's composure seemed to flicker. Something passed across his face too quickly to identify. Then it was gone and he was calm again. He said, "Just maintenance supplies, tools, equipment." Rodriguez asked if Tyler would consent to another polygraph. Tyler said yes. The test was scheduled for the following week. Clears throat. But before the polygraph could be administered, something else happened. On June 23, 2024, construction workers doing foundation repair at Mountain View Terrace made a discovery in the basement. They were excavating an area near the old furnace system, removing concrete to access the foundation, when they encountered something that wasn't supposed to be there. Human remains, wrapped in plastic, buried approximately 4 feet below the basement floor. The medical examiner was called. The area was secured. Forensic anthropologists carefully excavated the remains over the course of 2 days. The body was identified through dental records as Jennifer Marie Harris. She'd been there for 23 years, buried in the one place nobody had thought to look because it was concrete. Because who would think someone could bury a body beneath a basement floor in an occupied building? Further examination revealed she died from blunt force trauma to the head. The injury pattern suggested a single, powerful blow. Forensic analysis of the plastic wrapping, which had preserved evidence remarkably well, revealed fibers that matched materials commonly used in maintenance work. Duct tape on the wrapping contained partial fingerprints. Those fingerprints matched Tyler Morrison. The arrest came on June 27, 2024 at 7:15 in the morning. Tyler Morrison was at his apartment preparing for work when law enforcement arrived. He opened the door calmly when they knocked. When they told him he was under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Harris, he said nothing. He turned around, put his hands behind his back, and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. At the station, Tyler Morrison invoked his right to an attorney and stopped talking. He'd said enough already. The case that had languished for 23 years suddenly moved with startling speed. The district attorney's office filed first-degree murder charges on July 1st. The media coverage was intense. Reporters descended on Colorado Springs, interviewing anyone who'd known Jennifer, anyone who'd known Tyler, anyone with any connection to the case. Old footage from 2001 aired alongside new coverage. Jennifer's photograph appeared everywhere again, the same image from the missing persons flyers, her dark eyes staring out from television screens across the state. The community reaction was complex. Some residents of Mountain View Terrace were horrified to learn they'd been living above a burial site for decades. Others were angry that Tyler Morrison had been allowed to continue working there despite suspicions. Many struggled with the cognitive dissonance of someone seeming so normal while hiding such a monstrous secret. Jennifer's family released a statement through their attorney. Rachel Harris, now 46 years old, spoke at a press conference, her voice breaking as she said, "For 23 years we've waited. For 23 years we've hoped. We never imagined Jennifer was so close, that she'd been there all along. We're grateful for the investigators who never gave up, for the construction workers who found her, for everyone who kept her memory alive. Our family can finally lay our sister to rest." Robert and Susan Harris, now in their 70s, attended a memorial service in Colorado Springs in August. Susan held a photograph of Jennifer throughout the service, the same image from her missing persons flyers. The photograph showed Jennifer smiling, full of life, unaware that her time was so limited. The legal proceedings moved forward through the fall of 2024. Tyler Morrison's attorney filed motions to suppress evidence, arguing that the fingerprints on the tape could have gotten there through innocent contact during Tyler's work duties. The prosecution countered that Tyler had no documented reason to be handling plastic sheeting and duct tape in the exact configuration found on the body. They presented evidence of Tyler's pattern of behavior toward young women, his violations of Amanda Garrett's restraining order, his fixation and inability to accept rejection. In November 2024, facing overwhelming evidence, Tyler Morrison's attorney negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole and a full confession, the death penalty would be taken off the table. Tyler accepted the deal. His confession, delivered in a monotone voice in a windowless interview room, was chilling in its banality. He said he'd developed feelings for Jennifer. He said he'd asked her out several times and she'd always said no politely. He said on the morning of February 7, 2001, he'd seen her going down to start her car. He said he'd followed her to the parking lot. He said he'd tried one more time to convince her to go out with him. He said she'd been kind but firm in her rejection. He said something inside him snapped. He said he'd grabbed a piece of pipe he'd been carrying for a plumbing repair. He said he'd struck her once. He said she'd fallen and he'd known immediately she was gone. He said he'd panicked. He said he'd carried her to his truck, covered her with a tarp, driven around to the back of the building, and brought her into the basement through the exterior entrance. He said he'd wrapped her in plastic sheeting from his maintenance supplies. He said he'd waited until nighttime, then broken up a section of basement floor, buried her, and re-poured the concrete. He said the whole process had taken less than 24 hours. He said he'd expected to be caught immediately. He said when he wasn't, he'd simply continued living day after day, year after year, knowing she was there beneath his feet. When asked why he'd made the comment to David Park about the basement being a good place to store things, Tyler said he didn't know. He said maybe part of him wanted to be caught. He said carrying the secret for 23 years had been its own kind of prison. The plea was